Most people at the Laurent gala were looking at the diamonds, but Victor Laurent, he was looking at a miracle, and a crime he didn't know he committed. Across the marble floor of the grand ballroom, past the towering pyramids of crystal and the elite guests who never bothered to look down, Elijah Cole stood frozen. He didn't belong here. His black suit jacket was 2 sizes too big, and his shoes were scuffed from the long walk from the orphanage. He gripped the strap of his old satchel so hard his knuckles turned white. But then he saw her. Sitting by the golden pillar was a girl who looked like she'd been carved from the same dream. Isabella Laurent. She wore a white dress with gold buttons that cost more than Elijah's entire life. Her hair, the same thick, dark coils as his. Her eyes, the same wide, searching brown. Elijah walked toward her, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Isabella looked up, and for the first time in her life, the empty space she felt inside wasn't empty anymore. Elijah said, voice trembling, you have my face. Isabella didn't scream, she didn't call for her guard. She just tilted her head, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. Isabella said, are you my brother? Elijah replied, I don't have a sister, I don't have anyone. Isabella reached out, her small hand hovering near his. Isabella said, my daddy is the most powerful man in the world. If he's your daddy too, why are your clothes so old? Why did he leave you in the dark while I lived in the light? In the background, the glass in Victor Laurent's hand shattered. He wasn't just looking at a lookalike. He was looking at the son his mother told him had died 7 years ago. Now, before we uncover the dark secret inside Elijah's satchel, I have to ask you something, and I want you to be honest in the comments. If Victor truly didn't know his son was alive, does he deserve to be forgiven? Drop a Team Elijah, Team Isabella, or Team Victor below. Because what Victor does next is going to make half of you hate him and the other half cheer. Hit subscribe, because this story isn't just a reunion, it's a reckoning. Let's get into the story. The silence following the children's exchange was heavier than the gold-leafed ceiling above them. Isabella's hand remained suspended in the air, trembling slightly, as she waited for Elijah to answer the question that had just shattered 7 years of Laurent family history. Elijah didn't speak. Instead, his small, shaky fingers reached for the buckle of his scuffed leather satchel. The guests around them began to whisper, a low, rhythmic hum of scandal, but Victor Laurent heard nothing but the roar of his own pulse. He stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble, his eyes locked on the boy who possessed the face of a memory he had tried to bury. Elijah, Victor's voice was a jagged rasp, stripped of its usual billionaire authority. What is in that bag? Elijah looked up, his eyes wide and shimmering with a defensive fire. With a sharp tug, he pulled out a small, plastic-wrapped object. It was a photograph, its edges curled and blackened by fire, as if it had been rescued from the very heart of a tragedy. He held it out with both hands, offering it like a piece of his own soul. Victor took it, his hands shaking so violently the plastic crinkled. In the center of the frame, a woman with a radiant, tired smile sat in a hospital bed. She was holding 2 identical bundles wrapped in blue and white. The air left Victor's lungs. He had a copy of this photo in his safe, but in his version there was only one baby. In this version, the one Elijah had carried through years of cold orphanage hallways, there were clearly 2. On the back, written in his late wife's elegant, looping script, were 2 names, Isabella and Elijah, asterisk. She told me I was the only one, Victor whispered, the photograph slipping from his fingers. He looked at the background, where his mother, Margaret, stood watching with a face like carved ice. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't lost a son to death. He had lost him to a lie. Elijah wasn't just a guest. He was the heir Victor had been told never existed. The memory hit Victor with the cold precision of a surgical blade. He was no longer in the golden ballroom. He was back in the sterile, white-tiled silence of the St. Jude's maternity wing 7 years ago. The smell of antiseptic and lilies, too many lilies, filled his lungs. He remembered the way the monitors had flatlined, a long, haunting drone that signaled the end of his wife Alina's life. He had been slumped in a plastic chair, his head in his hands, waiting for a cry that never seemed to come. When the door finally creaked open, it wasn't a doctor who emerged, but his mother. Margaret Laurent had looked then exactly as she did now, unshakable. She had walked toward him, her heels clicking like a countdown on the linoleum floor. She didn't hug him. She didn't offer the comfort of a mother. Instead, she placed a firm, icy hand on his shoulder. "Victor," she had said, her voice a low, controlled anchor in his sea of grief. "There has been a complication. The labor was too much for them." He remembered looking up, his face wet with tears. "The Bobbies, my sons." Margaret's expression hadn't flinched. She didn't look like a woman delivering a death sentence. She looked like a woman balancing a ledger. Only one survived, Victor, the other. The weaker one. He was lost with Alina. "It is a mercy, truly. You have a daughter to raise. You must be strong for the Laurent legacy. The boy is gone." Victor had believed her. Why wouldn't he? She was his mother, the matriarch who had guarded their family's strength for decades. He had grieved for a shadow, a ghost he thought had died before its first breath. He never saw the second bassinet. He never saw the exchange of cash in the hospital basement. He simply took the one child he was given and walked into a life of partial light, never knowing that half of his heart had just been handed to a stranger in a dark alley. The chaos of the ballroom felt miles away as Isabella led Elijah through a heavy oak door and into a sanctuary of velvet and soft light. This was her private play area, a room designed for a princess, but filled with the hollow silence of an only child. Here the air didn't smell like expensive perfume and secrets. It smelled like vanilla and fresh linens. Isabella pulled Elijah toward a massive, floor-to-ceiling triptych mirror framed in gold. "Look," she whispered, her voice echoing off the silk-covered walls. "Look at us." They stood side by side, a study in impossible reflections. Elijah, in his oversized, borrowed suit, looked like a rough sketch of the polished girl beside him. He reached up, his small fingers trembling as he touched the glass. In the reflection, his hand met hers. They had the same high cheekbones, the same inquisitive arch in their brows, and the same constellation of faint freckles across the bridge of their noses. "My nanny says I'm special because I'm a Laurent," Isabella said, her eyes searching his in the mirror. "But you're not a Laurent. You live in a house with 100 other kids, so why do we have the same eyes?" Elijah leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass. "In my dreams, there's a lady who calls me her little lion. She has your hair, she has your smile." He looked at Isabella directly, the mirror doubling the intensity of the moment. "I thought I was just imagining her. I thought I was making up a mother because I didn't have one." Isabella felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. She reached out and brushed a stray, tight curl from Elijah's forehead. The texture was identical to her own. "You weren't imagining her," she realized, her voice breaking. "You were remembering her." The first time in their lives, the mirror didn't just show them their faces, it showed them the truth. They weren't strangers met by chance. They were two halves of a story that had been torn in middle, and the jagged edges were finally starting to align. Isabella moved with a sudden, frantic energy, her small hands trembling as she reached for the back of her own head. She pulled her dark, soft curls away from her neck, exposing the skin just behind her left ear. "Look," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant thrum of the gala still raging downstairs. Elijah leaned in, his breath hitching. There, etched into the pale skin behind her ear, was a small, distinct birthmark, a jagged shape that looked remarkably like a tiny, four-pointed star. It was a mark she had been told was a kiss from an angel her entire life, a unique seal of her Laurent blood. Without a word, Elijah turned his head. He reached up, pushing back his own unkempt curls in the exact same spot. Isabella gasped, her fingers flying to her mouth to stifle a cry. Behind Elijah's left ear sat the identical star. The same size, the same shape, positioned in the exact same location. The silence in the mirror room became absolute. This wasn't just a resemblance or a trick of the light, it was a biological signature. The orphan and the heiress weren't just similar, they were built from the same DNA, marked by the same hand before they had even entered the world. "Nurses at the home said it was just a mole," Elijah said, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp realization. "But I always felt like it was a button. Like if I pressed it hard enough, someone would finally hear me." Isabella reached out, her thumb gently brushing the mark on Elijah's neck. As her skin touched his, a wave of profound recognition swept through them both. It was the final piece of the puzzle, a truth so undeniable that even the most powerful lie couldn't bury it. They weren't just lookalikes caught in a moment of confusion. They were a shattered family, and for the first time in 7 years, the pieces were finally touching. The heavy oak doors of the playroom didn't open so much as they surrendered, yielding to a presence that chilled the air before she even stepped inside. Margaret Laurent stood in the threshold, her silhouette framed by the golden light of the hallway, looking less like a grandmother and more like a statue carved from winter. She didn't look at the toys, the velvet chairs, or the spilled sunlight. Her eyes, sharp and predatory, went straight to Elijah. Isabella instinctively stepped in front of him, her hand still clutching his sleeve. "Grandmother," she started, her voice small, "look what I found. This is Elijah and he has my—" "Isabella, go to your room," Margaret interrupted. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying, low-frequency authority that brooked no argument. It was the sound of a woman who moved mountains and silenced rivals with a single word. "But grandmother," his face. "Now," Margaret snapped, the word hitting like a physical strike. As Isabella retreated, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear, Margaret stepped closer to the boy in the oversized suit. She didn't look at him with wonder or the shock that had paralyzed Victor. She looked at him with profound, clinical distaste. To her, Elijah wasn't a miracle. He was a defect in a perfect system, a ghost that had failed to stay dead. She leaned down until she was inches from his face, the scent of expensive lilies and something metallic, like old coins, filling Elijah's senses. She didn't touch him as if he were something that might stain her silk gloves. "You have a very familiar face, little boy," she whispered, her eyes devoid of any human warmth. "But faces can be replaced, and memories can be erased. You shouldn't have come here. Some things are taken away for a reason." She straightened up, her shadow falling over him, long and jagged against the gold-framed mirrors. In that moment, Elijah realized that the orphanage hadn't been his greatest danger. The real threat was standing right in front of him, draped in diamonds and a cold, calculating malice. While Margaret stood like a sentinel in the playroom, Victor was in his private study, the air thick with the scent of leather and the frantic energy of a man trying to outrun a lie. His hands, usually steady enough to sign billion-dollar mergers, fumbled with his phone. The photograph, the real one, the one with two bobbies, lay face up on his desk, a silent accusation. He dialed the number for the St. Jude's Children's Home, the name stitched into the collar of the oversized jacket Elijah had been wearing. His heart hammered against his ribs, a rhythmic dread building with every ring. "St. Jude's, how can I help you?" A woman's voice answered, sounding weary and overworked. "This is Victor Laurent," he said, his voice tight. "I'm calling regarding one of your charges. A boy named Elijah Cole. He's about 7 years old, curly hair, light brown skin. I need his intake records and the name of the person who dropped him off." There was a long silence on the other end, followed by the rapid-fire clicking of a keyboard. Victor held his breath, his eyes fixed on the hospital photo. He expected a list of dates, a name, a paper trail that would lead him back to the son he had accidentally abandoned. "Sorry, Mr. Laurent," the woman said, her voice now tinged with confusion. "I've checked our active files and our archives. We have no record of an Elijah Cole." Victor froze. "That's impossible. He's wearing your uniform. He has been there for years." "Sir, I'm looking at the digital ledger and the physical backup. We don't have anyone by that name. In fact, we haven't had an intake matching that description in over a decade." Victor stared at the phone. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a vanishing act. Someone wasn't just hiding Elijah, they were deleting him. As the line went dead, Victor realized the terrifying scale of the power he was fighting. Elijah wasn't just an orphan, he was a ghost being exorcised in real time. Victor descended the stairs, his face a mask of barely contained fury and terror, to find Elijah standing alone by the tall windows of the playroom. The boy looked small against the vast expanse of the night sky, but his posture was unusually still, his gaze fixed on something invisible. "Elijah," Victor said, his voice softer now, pleading. "The orphanage. They say you were never there. They say you don't exist." Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the billionaire. He kept his eyes on the glass. "I remember the song," he whispered. "It's about a garden where the sun never goes down. She used to sing it when the lights went out." Victor stopped mid-stride. "That song. Alina had written it herself, a private lullaby she had only ever hummed to her belly in the quiet hours of the night. She had a silver ring, Elijah continued, his photographic memory unfolding like a vivid tapestry. It looked like a vine with a tiny emerald leaf. When she touched my cheek, the metal was always cold, but her hand was warm. And she had a small scar right here, he pointed to the corner of his own left eye, from when she was a little girl playing in the rain. Victor felt the world tilt. These weren't details one could find in a newspaper or a public record. The ring had been buried with Alina. The scar was so faint only those who had kissed her face ever noticed it. Elijah wasn't just guessing. He was reconstructing a woman he shouldn't have known with a precision that was hauntingly beautiful. She called me her little lion, Elijah said, finally turning to face Victor. And she told me that no matter how dark it got, I should always look for the light because you would be there to find me. Boy's eyes searched Victor's, filled with a devastating hope. But it was dark for a long time, Victor. Why did it take so long for the light to come? Victor didn't have time to answer Elijah's heartbreaking question before his phone vibrated with a violent, rhythmic intensity. It was Marcus, his head of global security, a man who had successfully guarded Laurent's secrets for a decade. Victor stepped away from Elijah, his hand trembling as he pressed the device to his ear. "Sir, we have a Tier 1 breach." Marcus's voice was clipped, stripped of its usual professional calm. "I'm in the server room. Someone isn't just trying to get into our system. They're already inside and they're burning everything down." Victor felt a cold sweat break across his neck. "What do you mean, burning?" The facial recognition logs from tonight's gala. "Wiped. The guest check-in scans, corrupted. Even the cloud backups for the hospital files you accessed 10 minutes ago are being overwritten with garbage data. It's a targeted digital erasure, sir. Someone is systematically scrubbing every piece of evidence that the boy ever stepped foot in this building." Victor looked through the glass at Elijah, who was watching a single tear fall down Isabella's face. The boy was real, breathing, and standing mere feet away, yet according to the world's digital memory, he was becoming a ghost. "Can you trace it?" Victor hissed. "It's coming from inside the house, sir," Marcus replied, the weight of the revelation hanging in the air. "The override commands are using a level alpha clearance code. Only 2 people in the world have that code, you and your mother." Victor looked toward the hallway where Margaret had disappeared. He realized then that this wasn't just a family secret, it was a war. His mother wasn't just hiding the past, she was actively murdering the present. She was using the very empire Victor had built to delete his son's existence. He looked back at Elijah, the boy with the photographic memory, and realized that the only record of the truth left in the world was stored inside the mind of a 7-year-old orphan. And Margaret knew it, too. The sound of Marcus's warning still echoed in Victor's mind when the heavy double doors of the playroom swung open again. This time, Margaret wasn't alone. Behind her stood 2 men in sterile gray suits, their expressions neutral and professional, carrying clipboards that looked like weapons in the soft light of the nursery. "Grandmother, what is happening?" Isabella asked, her voice trembling as she tightened her grip on Elijah's hand. Margaret didn't look at her granddaughter. She looked at Victor, her face a mask of practiced concern. "Victor, the excitement has clearly overwhelmed you. I've called the authorities. These gentlemen are from social services. They've been informed of a lost, disturbed child who has wandered into a private event. They are here to return him to the proper channels." "Isn't lost, mother," Victor said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low vibrato. "And he isn't going anywhere." One of the men stepped forward, his tone smooth and patronizing. "Mr. Laurent, we have a report of a child with no legal identification, no record of residency, and no guardian present. For the boy's own safety, he must be processed. We've already contacted the central intake facility. Proper channels don't have a record of him because you deleted them," Victor shouted, the polished composure of the Laurent Empire finally cracking. Margaret sighed, a sound of weary disappointment. "You see, my son is unwell. Grief does strange things to the mind. He's seeing ghosts in a stranger's face." She turned her cold gaze to Elijah. "Come now, boy, you don't belong in this house. You're making everyone very uncomfortable." Men moved toward Elijah, their shadows stretching across the floor like reaching fingers. Elijah didn't run. He stood his ground, but his small body began to shake. He looked at the half-burned photo in Victor's hand, then at the two men coming to take him back to the silence. It was the first betrayal, not by a stranger, but by the woman who shared his blood and was now using the law to finish what she had started 7 years ago. Victor moved before the social workers could take another step. He didn't just walk. He commanded the space between the agents and the trembling boy, his broad shoulders creating a human wall that shielded Elijah from their cold, bureaucratic reach. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with the sudden, violent shift in his energy. "Step back," Victor commanded, his voice no longer a whisper of grief but a low, dangerous growl that stopped the men in their tracks. "Mr. Laurent, please be reasonable," the lead agent stuttered, clutching his clipboard like a shield. "The boy has no legal status here. We are simply following the protocol for an unidentified minor found on private property." "Is not unidentified," Victor snapped, his eyes flashing with a fire that made even Margaret take a half step back. "And he is not a guest of the property. He is my guest, my personal guest. And in this house, my word is the only protocol that matters." Victor reached back without looking, his hand finding Elijah's small, cold shoulder and drawing him firmly against his side. The physical contact was an unspoken vow. "If you want to process him, you'll have to process me first. Because this child stays here under my protection until I personally verify every lie that has been told tonight." Margaret's face twisted into a mask of silver-haired fury. "Victor, you are making a spectacle of yourself in front of our staff. This is madness." "He is a stranger. He is the truth, Mother," Victor replied, turning his gaze toward her, his expression as hard as flint. "And for the first time in 7 years, I'm not letting you bury it." He looked down at Elijah, whose wide eyes were fixed on the man who was finally, for the first time, fighting for him. Victor's grip tightened, not out of aggression, but out of a desperate, newfound need to hold on. The agents hesitated, glancing at Margaret, then at the billionaire whose silhouette now defined the boy's entire world. For tonight, at least, the light had finally arrived. The silence that followed Victor's stand was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that filled the room as the agents retreated. Victor led the children to a velvet sofa, his hand never leaving Elijah's shoulder, but as he sat down, he realized the boy was as rigid as stone. Elijah wasn't looking at the door or the grandmother who had tried to banish him. He was looking at Victor's hands, hands that wore a ring worth more than the orphanage's entire yearly budget. "Elijah," Victor began, his voice thick with a decade of unshed tears, "I need you to understand. I was told you didn't make it. I thought I was laying you to rest beside your mother." Elijah finally looked up. His eyes weren't filled with the wonder of the ballroom anymore. They were filled with the cold, analytical clarity of a child who had spent 7 years trying to solve the mystery of his own existence. "The orphanage was very cold in the winter," Elijah said softly, his voice devoid of accusation, which only made the words cut deeper. "And the food was always thin. I used to watch the cars drive past the gates, shiny cars like the ones outside." He paused, his gaze dropping to the scuffed toes of his shoes. "Did you sell me, Victor? Did you give me away because I was the broken one?" The question hit Victor with the force of a physical blow, stripping away his breath. Behind them, Isabella let out a small, broken sob, clutching her brother's hand. Victor gasped, his heart fracturing. "Never, not for all the money in the world." "You're so rich," Elijah whispered, a single tear finally escaping and tracking through the dust on his cheek. "If you're the most powerful man in the city, how did you lose me? How did you forget to look for me?" Victor reached out, his fingers trembling as he cupped the boy's face, but he had no answer that could heal 7 years of abandonment. He realized then that reclaiming his son was the easy part. Earning the right to be called his father would be the hardest battle of his life. The weight of Elijah's questions hung in the air like a death sentence, but Victor knew that words wouldn't be enough to bridge 7 years of silence. He needed the one thing the Laurent Empire had always traded in: cold, hard evidence. Leaving the children under the watch of Marcus and a hand-picked security detail, Victor drove through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul, heading toward the one place where his life had been systematically dismantled: St. Jude's Maternity Hospital. The hospital was quiet, a stark contrast to the thrumming gala he had just fled. Victor didn't wait for permissions or appointments. He moved through the lobby with the terrifying focus of a man who had nothing left to lose. When the overnight administrator tried to block the path to the basement archives, Victor didn't argue. He simply leaned in and whispered a figure that could buy the wing 3 times over. The locks clicked open. The archives were a subterranean labyrinth of dust and paper, the analog backup his mother had overlooked in her digital purge. Victor tore through the boxes of 2019, his breath coming in ragged hitches as he searched for the physical delivery logs. Finally, he found it, a heavy, leather-bound ledger. He flipped the pages until he reached the date of Isabella's birth. There, in the original ink of a nurse long since retired, was the truth Margaret had tried to burn. The entry read, Patient Alina Laurent, 11:04 p.m., Twin A, female, Twin B, male, but beneath it in a different hurried handwriting a line had been drawn through Twin B. A frantic note in the margin read, Stillborn, records to be moved to private disposal per M. Laurent. Asterisk Victor's knees hit the concrete floor. The disposal hadn't been a grave, it had been a transaction. His mother hadn't just lied. She had edited his son out of the world's memory with a pen stroke. He clutched the ledger to his chest, the paper smelling of old secrets and betrayal. He had the proof. Now he had to stop the woman who was already moving to destroy the evidence that was currently breathing in his nursery. The damp air of the hospital vault felt like a tomb as Victor traced the ink on the final page of the disposal file. His eyes burned, but he refused to look away from the jagged, elegant script at the bottom of the release form. It was a signature he had seen 1,000 times on birthday cards, inheritance papers, and multi-billion-dollar contracts. Asterisk Margaret Laurent. Asterisk the date was stamped just 4 hours after the twins' birth. While Victor had been sedated with grief in a waiting room upstairs, his mother had been down here, signing away a human life as if it were a faulty piece of equipment. The form authorized the transfer of the deceased minor to a private facility for immediate handling. There was no mention of a funeral, no mention of a burial plot, just a cold, clinical handoff. A second document was tucked behind the first, a wire transfer receipt from a private Laurent offshore account to an anonymous shell company. The amount was staggering. It wasn't the price of a burial, it was the price of a boy's future. It was the cost of making sure Elijah Cole would grow up in a world where no one would ever look for him. You didn't just lie, Mother, Victor whispered, his voice cracking in the empty silence of the vault. You sold him. The betrayal tasted like ash in his mouth. Every I love you Margaret had uttered over the last 7 years, every holiday spent celebrating Isabella's milestones, had been built on the foundation of this forged silence. She had looked Victor in the eye every single day, knowing his son was out there shivering in a dormitory, and she had never blinked. Victor gripped the edges of the file, his knuckles white. The evidence was in his hands, but as he heard the distant, muffled sound of a siren in the street above, a new terror took hold. Margaret had never been one to leave a mess behind. If she knew he had found the vault, she wouldn't just be deleting files anymore. She would be moving to erase the only thing left that could link her to the crime, the boy himself. He shoved the papers into his coat and ran for the exit, the weight of the truth heavier than any empire. Isabella stood in the darkened hallway, her small frame hidden behind a velvet curtain near her grandmother's private study. She had been looking for Victor, but the low, sharp cadence of Margaret's voice stopped her cold. It was the sound of a predator arranging a kill, and it made the hair on Isabella's neck stand up. Jet is ready at the private terminal, Margaret was saying into her phone, her tone as clinical as if she were scheduling a shipment of steel. He doesn't have a passport, but that has been handled. By sunrise, the boy will be in a facility in Zurich. They specialize in high-level discretion. He will have a new name, a new history, and he will never see the Laurent crest again. Isabella's breath hitched. A facility, Zurich. She didn't know where Zurich was, but she knew what never meant. My son is compromise-driven right now, Margaret continued, her silhouette packing against the frosted glass of the door. He thinks he can play father to a ghost. I am merely removing the temptation. Once the boy is across the border, Victor will realize that some secrets are meant to stay buried. He'll grieve, he'll move on, and the legacy will remain pure. Pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle a sob. She thought of Elijah's scuffed shoes and the way his hand had felt in hers, cold but steady. She thought of the star-shaped mark behind his ear. He wasn't a temptation or a ghost. He was her brother. She realized then that her father wasn't there to save them, and the guards at the door worked for the woman in the study. If she stayed silent, the morning sun would rise on a world where she was once again an only child, haunted by a memory she couldn't prove. Isabella turned and ran toward the nursery, her silk dress rustling like a warning. For the first time in her life, the billionaire's daughter wasn't going to follow the rules. She was going to choose the boy with her face. The nursery door creaked open, and Isabella flew to Elijah's side, her eyes bright with a panicked clarity. She didn't explain the jet or the city in Switzerland. She simply grabbed his hand, her fingers locking with his in a desperate grip. "We have to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Grandmother is going to send you to a place where the sun never comes up. We have to find Daddy." Elijah didn't hesitate. He slung his scuffed satchel over his shoulder, the weight of his mother's photograph thumping against his hip like a second heartbeat. Together, they slipped out of the French doors and into the sprawling Laurent gardens. The midnight air was cold, smelling of damp earth, and the expensive roses Isabella's father kept perfectly manicured. Behind them, the mansion loomed like a golden cage, its windows glowing with the light of 100 secrets. They moved through the shadows of the hedges, two small figures running against the clock. Isabella knew every turn of the stone paths, every hidden alcove where she had spent her lonely afternoons. "The service gate," she panted, her silk dress catching on a thorn and tearing with a sharp, violent hiss. She didn't stop to look. "If we reach the road, we can find a taxi. We can find the light." Elijah looked back once, seeing the flashlights of security guards beginning to dance across the limestone terrace. He felt a surge of terror, the familiar, crushing weight of being removed. But then he felt Isabella's hand tighten on his. For 7 years, he had run alone. Now he was running with his own face reflected beside him. They reached the iron gate at the edge of the estate, the metal cold and forbidding. Beyond it lay the city, a sea of flickering lights where they were nothing but two children in a world of giants. They scrambled through the gap in the bars, the gravel biting into their knees, and vanished into the darkness of the street just as the first sirens began to wail in the distance. Victor's arrival at the Laurent corporate headquarters was not a homecoming, it was an invasion. He didn't wait for the security team to announce him. He kicked open the double mahogany doors of the boardroom, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the hollow, expensive silence. Margaret sat at the head of the obsidian table, a single lamp illuminating her face while the rest of the room remained in shadow. She didn't look up from her tablet. She looked like a queen who had already won the war. "Children are gone, Victor," she said, her voice a cool, clinical ribbon of sound. "And by now the boy is being processed for a flight he will never return from. You should have stayed in the vault. You always had a sentimental streak that clouded your judgment." Victor didn't scream. He didn't overturn the table. Instead, he walked toward her with a predatory slowness, pulling the damp, crumpled hospital ledger and the forged release forms from his coat. He slammed them onto the obsidian surface directly in front of her. "I found the paper trail, Mother," Victor hissed, his voice trembling with a decade of suppressed rage. "I found the wire transfer to the shell company. I found the signature you used to sell my son like he was a rounding error in a quarterly report." Margaret finally looked at the papers. She didn't flinch. She didn't show guilt. She simply smoothed a stray hair from her forehead. "I did what was necessary for the lineage." A twin with a heart defect and a temperament for dreams, he was a liability. "I gave you the perfect heir in Isabella. I pruned the branch so the tree could thrive." "You didn't prune a branch," Victor roared, leaning over the table until his face was inches from hers. "You mutilated my family. You stole 7 years of my son's life because he didn't fit your balance sheet." He leaned closer, his eyes cold and final. "The police are already at the private terminal. The board has been notified of your retirement. You aren't the matriarch anymore, Margaret. You're just a woman who is about to lose everything." Margaret didn't flinch at the threat of the police or the loss of her title. She rose from her seat with a chilling, regal composure, her silhouette casting a long, sharp shadow over the evidence of her crimes. She walked toward the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city lights as if she still owned every soul beneath them. "You speak of family as if it's a collection of sentimental moments, Victor," she said, her voice dropping to a low, rhythmic hum. "But a legacy like ours is a garden, and a gardener who refuses to pull the weeds is the one who kills the flowers." She turned back to him, her eyes devoid of regret. The boy was born with a murmur in his heart and a gaze that was too soft. Even as an infant, he was a mirror of your father's indecision. He was the weak link in a chain that had to remain unbroken. If I had left him by your side, he would have drained your resources, your time, and your focus. He would have been a shadow over Isabella's brilliance. Victor felt a wave of nausea. "He's a child, mother, my son." "Was a liability," Margaret corrected, her tone as sharp as a razor. "I didn't destroy your family, Victor. I perfected it. I removed the flaw so that the Laurent name could stand on a foundation of absolute strength. I gave you a life of power and a daughter of pure potential. I traded a broken boy for a perfect empire, and if I had to do it again, I would sign those papers 1,000 times over." She stepped closer, her face a mask of cold, terrifying conviction. "You think you're saving him, but you're only inviting the rot back into the house. I made you a king. Don't blame me because you lack the stomach to wear the crown." Victor stared at her, finally seeing the monster behind the matriarch. She hadn't just stolen his son. She had tried to justify the theft as an act of love for a name that meant nothing without the people who carried it. Outside, the distant sound of the service gate alarm began to wail, signaling that the flaw she had tried to erase was currently running for his life. The notification chime of Victor's phone was a hollow digital intrusion into the heavy silence of the boardroom. He pulled the device from his pocket, the screen glowing with a sterile white light. It was an encrypted message from the private lab, the results of the rapid sequence DNA comparison he had ordered the moment he saw Elijah's face in the ballroom. His thumb hovered over the file. For 7 years, his life had been governed by the truth found in documents, ledgers, and signatures. He had allowed paper to tell him who was dead and who was alive, which branch of his family was thriving and which had been pruned. Margaret watched him from the shadows, her eyes narrowed. "Open it, Victor," she challenged, her voice a poisonous thread. "See the biological reality. See if that boy is truly worth the ruin of this company." Victor looked at the screen, then looked at the charred photograph of Alina, and finally at the empty doorway through which his children had fled. He didn't need a double helix mapped out on a screen to tell him the origin of the fire in the boy's eyes, or the curve of the smile that matched Isabella. Exactly. He didn't need a percentage of probability to confirm the soul he had felt the moment his hand touched Elijah's shoulder. With a slow, deliberate motion, Victor didn't tap the file. Instead, he swiped the entire message into the trash and initiated a permanent wipe of the lab's server. Then he took his phone and snapped it in half, the screen spidering into 1,000 useless shards. "I don't need a lab to tell me who my son is, Mother," Victor said, his voice reaching a level of calm that was far more terrifying than his rage. "The paper trail ends tonight. From this moment on, the only biological reality that matters is that I am his father, and you are nothing to us." He turned his back on her, leaving the forged forms and the shattered phone on the table. He wasn't a king protecting a legacy anymore. He was a man going to find his children in the dark, guided by a truth that no ink could ever erase. The iron gates of the Laurent estate didn't feel like a barrier anymore. They felt like a threshold. A week had passed since the night of the rain and the revelations, and the silence that now filled the halls was no longer heavy with secrets, but light with the sounds of a house coming back to life. Elijah's scuffed satchel sat on the marble floor of the grand foyer, next to Isabella's polished school bag. He didn't look like a defect or a ghost today. He wore a sweater that actually fit, though he still carried his mother's photograph in his pocket, a talisman of the woman who had loved him before the world tried to forget him. Victor stood at the top of the stairs, watching the 2 children sitting on the floor together, hunched over a sprawling map of the world. There were no social workers in the corners, no security chief scrubbing digital histories, and no matriarch casting a shadow from the boardroom. Margaret was gone, relegated to a quiet, distant exile where her perfection could no longer touch the living. "Look, Elijah," Isabella pointed to a spot on the map. "This is where the mountains are. Daddy said we can go there this summer, all three of us." Elijah looked up, his gaze meeting Victor. For the first time, the boy didn't look for a way out. He didn't look like he was waiting for the light to be snatched away. He simply nodded, a small, tentative smile touching his face, a smile that was imperfect, human, and entirely his own. Victor walked down to join them, sitting on the cold marble without a thought for his tailored suit. He realized then that the Laurent legacy hadn't been destroyed, it had been reborn. It was no longer a story of cold steel and calculated bloodlines. It was a messy, breathing thing, defined not by the absence of flaws, but by the courage to claim them. The house was finally full, the circle was finally closed, and for the first time in 7 years, the name Laurent finally meant home. The Laurent legacy was never found in the gold on the walls or the zeros in a bank account. It was hidden in the resilience of a boy who refused to be forgotten, and a father who chose blood over cold perfection. This story reminds us that true family isn't a business transaction, and no amount of power can erase the truth of the heart. If this journey moved you, let us know in the comments. Would you have forgiven Margaret? Please like and share this video to spread the message, and subscribe for more gripping tales of mystery and justice.